IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Over the last few weeks, we've seen several US officials, both civilian and military, lay out plans for tackling the challenge that is China. Now, of course, much of these plans are quite rightly diplomatic and economic, but there's also the necessary military component. And today I'm joined by Aditya Parikh. So it's going to be an episode with Aditya Ramanathan and Aditya Parikh, an Aditya episode. And what we plan to discuss is that military component, or at least the proposed military component of America's future China policy. And it's been given the name Pacific Deterrence Initiative. So I want to begin with the basics, Aditya. What is the Pacific Deterrence Initiative? And what has prompted this proposal for something like 30 billion additional dollars going up to 2027? Is this part of a new push by the Biden administration, or is this something coming from primarily the US Navy?
Radha, it's great to be back on the show. And let me say that from what I've read, the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, it has its roots in 2017 when the late Senator John McCain, he put forward something called the Indo-Pacific Stability Initiative. So it was presented to the US's Senate Armed Services Committee, and they briefly looked at it, but it didn't really go anywhere at the time. After that, in 2019, the US Congress asked the Pacific Command and its commander-in-chief, who's often a four-star admiral of the US Navy, to compile a list of resources that his command would need for their operational obligations in an ideal world. So what they submitted was an elaborate 6-year strategic assessment report, which was titled Regain the Advantage. And they were asking for about 20 billion US dollars in spending for their assets, their bases, their logistics for them. And their idea was to adequately fulfill the responsibility of maintaining force levels in the area that they've been charged with, the Indo-Pacific. So the US depends a lot on its allies, and in the region, it really has a lot of stake. So its allies and the bases that they provide make up for the bastion of the US security umbrella in the region. And obviously, maintaining these bastions, it costs a lot of resources, it costs a lot fiscally. And it also really is about the geopolitical equations in the region and exchanging favors with these important allies. So, in December 2020, the US defense budget, as it is laid out in the National Defense Authorization Act, so the process that they have for laying out their defense spending and getting it cleared through the legislation. So, they had a provision for about 2.2 billion US dollars for this Pacific Deterrence Initiative. And now in March 2021, there was another request by the Indo-PACOM and their commander-in-chief for about 4.7 billion US dollars, which would be needed for financial year 2021, 2022. And they've also asked for additional funding amounting to about 22.7 billion US dollars spread out until 2027. So Admiral Phil Davidson, who's the commander-in-chief currently of the Indo-PACOM, US Indo-PACOM, he has also testified in front of the US Congress for his request very recently. So the transcript has been out for a while now, a few days at least. So the US has a bunch of initiatives like this all over the world. For example, they have the European Deterrence Initiative in Europe, where the US and NATO perceives Russia as a threat to Ukraine in the Baltics. And for when we're talking about Southeast Asia and the ASEANs, the US has this program called Maritime Security Initiative. And more specifically, if I can recall an instance, Philippines not too long ago received a donation of anti-tank guided missiles and Scan Eagle UAVs. So the US has been going around the world distributing aid and reassuring allies in that sense?
Thanks, Aditya, for giving us the broader perspective of how the Pacific Deterrence Initiative fits into broader U.S. Approaches to various regions of the world. Just to set the stage for our listeners, after the Second World War, the U.S. basically obviously dominated this entire area, right? So they had bases in the Philippines, in Taiwan, in South Korea, and Japan. The base in Taiwan is long gone. Subic Bay in Philippines also went away. And really what the US is left with, if you go west of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, are Guam, which is a US territory, and you have Japan and South Korea. So these are some of the key US land-based facilities from which it can project power into the Western Pacific. Now, how has the US really projected power since the 1940s? It's obviously focused on these big aircraft carrier groups. And aircraft carrier groups are extremely formidable instruments of naval and really political power, but they take a lot of time to deploy. And once they're in the theater, they do possess a lot of firepower. But when you're dealing with another state, that firepower can get expended fairly quickly. If you look, for example, at the last 30 odd years, US aircraft carrier groups have been very useful in the sort of conflicts the US has fought. The US is able to project power deep into the Middle East using its Navy. It was even able to use its Navy in the campaign in Afghanistan. The US has also not really faced an adversary with a serious Air Force. Knocking out Syrian Air Force jet, is not that big a deal. And even more formidable enemies like the Yugoslav Air Force and Yugoslav air defenses in the 1990s are nothing compared to, say, what China would be able to wield. And if you are operating in the Western Pacific, you are operating very close to the Chinese mainland, where China obviously hoards a vast amount of military power. And a lot of this is, of course, standoff weapons. So, Aditya, I want you to give us an idea of what these standoff weapons are and how they're driving US concerns about deterrence in the Pacific, and how the US is planning to go about this, because it seems to me like they're moving away from the idea of the centrality of the aircraft carrier group.
So, be glad to, Aditya. The US has been concerned about China's ability for anti-access area denial for a long time, as we know. And standoff weapons are something that they've invested in quite a bit. So, when we talk about what kind of missiles can China bring to bear against the US and allied forces in the region, so I think we should talk about the stockpile, because, that is why the US is spending so much. The US is extending itself so much in the region. So China's ballistic missile stockpile is roughly about 1,200 short-range ballistic missiles, about 200 to 300 medium-range ballistic missiles, and about 75 to 100 ICBMs. That's intercontinental ballistic missiles. And these can be used as, some of them can be used as nuclear platforms and non-nuclear platforms, obviously. So let me just say that these figures have been derived from a primer that Commander Saurav Mohanty of the National Maritime Foundation wrote recently. So I'd really recommend that our listeners check that out, and we'd link it in the description of this episode. So coming back to the topic, The Economist recently did a very nice story with a pretty slick graphic illustrating the ranges of these standoff missiles that China fields. So the biggest point being reiterated is that China is fielding the DF-21D, which is kind of a mainstay whenever somebody talks about anti-ship ballistic missiles. So it has been a huge concern for the US establishment, and that's something that is dominating the discourse right now as well. So DF-21D has a range of about 1,500 kilometers, and there's another variant called the DF-26 that can strike up to 4,000 kilometers. These are, as I just mentioned, anti-shipping carrier killer ballistic missiles. So these are supposed to carry both a conventional and a nuclear warhead. So it's really a big concern for the US Navy and their fleet's pride, that are the carrier battle groups. So there's also the DF-17, which is a hypersonic glide vehicle equipped medium-range ballistic missile. And there's the MD-1, which is a 290-kilometer range, sea skimming supersonic cruise missile. There's the YJ-100, which is a 650-kilometer range to rough equivalent to the Russian anti-shipping cruise missile and the USS Tomahawk. So it's a rough equivalent to those. And also of concern is the H-6J strategic bomber, which is basically a licensed, further developed version of a Tu-16, which went out of the Russian inventory a long time ago. So this aircraft can carry about 500-kilometer range to YJ-12 anti-shipping supersonic cruise missile, which can be used to hit shipping. So I think they're learning so much from the Soviet-Russian blackjack playbook that I bet they dream of that famous Red Storm Rising moment in Tom Clancy's book, where a U.S. Aircraft carrier gets attacked by a flight of Russian bombers and is almost sunk.
Yeah, only of course, this time it may be not so much bombers as perhaps missiles. So of course, we never can tell. It's really fascinating how the PLA seem to be thinking about these missiles. Sometime back, I think late last year, there was reporting around a satellite image of what was a PLA rocket force ballistic missile impact test range in western China, showing what appeared to be or what appeared to mirror a US aircraft carrier parked in the Yokosuka naval base in Japan. If China were to do something like that, it would be a bolt out of the blue type of strike. So it's interesting to consider what kind of alternatives the Chinese are thinking about. Now obviously it's the responsibility of governments to try out all sorts of things, to keep their options open. But clearly, the US is worried about what these capabilities are going to mean if shots are actually fired. Now, if China has these formidable capabilities, Aditya, how does the US address them? Is it going to send those aircraft carrier battle groups right in? To me, it would seem like they would obviously have to keep those aircraft carriers at least out of the range of fixed wing aircrafts.
So, as far as I remember, it's been a concern since at least 2017, as I mentioned with Senator John McCain. So, then a lot of talk about China and North Korea's gargantuan short and medium range ballistic and cruise missile stockpiles emerged at the time. So, from the US's perspective for Asia, the brunt of any conflict, except for Southeast Asia nations, will be bearing down on US bases in Japan, Republic of Korea, and Guam. From China's angle, this is to have standoff weapons that can contain US military and allied bases potential to threaten them, which the US interprets as I previously mentioned, anti-access area denial. So when standoff conventional weapons are in question, it's a constant game of one-upmanship. And the fact that the US is now looking to build a bunch of precision missile strike systems on what it calls the first island chain, comprised of Okinawa of Japan, Taiwan, and some islands in the Philippines. And then an air defense network around southeastern Japan, Guam, and south to Indonesia. The key request for air defense system is one coming out of, as I previously mentioned, US Indo-PACOM for an Aegis Ashore system. So they're thinking of a 360-degree air defense system in Guam, and Japan has its own missile defense needs. It has to defend against ballistic missiles coming out of North Korea, China, and Russia. So their own missile defense needs, which at this point I don't think would be fulfilled by shore-based Aegis systems, but rather new naval destroyers.
Right. So it would seem like they're talking about much lighter, more nimble platforms, greater dispersion, and so on. Can you tell us, Aditya, also about how Indo-PACOM has been talking about these developments?
So the Indo-PACOM's current chief, Admiral Phil Davidson, has spoken a lot about the Pacific Deterrence Initiative and the security situation in the region that he's charged with maintaining. So I've seen the transcript of a speech he gave at AFCEA, TechNet Indo-Pacific Conference. So it's a conference in the US military's communications specialist sphere. So as we know, the US military has this paradigm of making a community out of it, serving experts and retired experts and doing consultations with them. So it's a similar kind of a platform. So there he was talking about the PDI and how it is important to credible deterrence from joint forces in the region and to extend this set credible deterrence to counter hypersonic glide vehicles, which might be a threat in the coming years. So I guess we'll link the transcript in the description. But he gave a pretty good overview of where and what key systems, in terms of sensors, maritime domain awareness apparatus, including information fusion centers, like the one we have in Gurugram for the Indian Navy, similar fusion centers across the Indo-Pacific, and space assets too. So he was also talking about this 360-degree air defense system in Guam, and over the horizon radar, things like that. So he was laying out what kind of part these systems were going to play. And obviously, it was all unclassified information, of course, and declaring them as peace by wielding capability deterrence kind of a tactic, in my opinion.
Right. That seems to be fairly standard and restrained sort of communication that we typically see from the U.S. Armed Forces. So, on the face of it, PDI looks like a good thing and so on. But any such policy, of course, has unintended consequences. PDI looks to be targeted primarily at China, with maybe North Korea being an afterthought. What about other countries in the region? Could this have some other unintended consequences, cause some new wrinkles in the various bilateral relations that you have in Northeast Asia?
So I'm glad you asked this question. So I recently mentioned in my blog about Russia-Japan relations, how this will have an unintended consequence of complicating the Japan-Russia relationship. Because even when the US is focusing on China and North Korea to some extent, the Russians are also perceiving it as a threat. And they've had issues with Aegis air defense systems cooperation between US and Japan. So the US has talked about how PDI has been about to credible deterrence against China, and to some degree North Korea. But Russia really has nothing to lose, as far as I understand, from lashing out at this development. So they've been very vocal about US pulling out of the INF treaty. That's the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which the US pulled out of in 2019. And even before that, I can recall at least one statement by the Russian government, which was calling the Aegis Ashore plans that Japan had in 2017 violation of the INF treaty's terms and a threat on Russia's eastern border. So this will have a fallout on Japan's negotiations with Moscow on the return of the Kuril Islands, which, as we know, are already pretty iced over, at least from Moscow's side. So the no alienation of Russian territory is allowed, a law that they have in the new constitution of Russia. So that no talk of trading sovereignty in the constitution. I think they're going to be even more icy in their approach to these negotiations. So one more interesting thing happened recently. So this former Japanese diplomat called Akio Kawato, he recently published an op-ed in Newsweek Japan. That's the name of the publication, Newsweek Japan. So I'm quoting it from an English translation of the Japanese article. In that, he said, we can show that the Soya Strait and the Sugaru Strait, which are the main supply and logistic route between the Russian mainland and the four northern islands, this is referring to the Kuril Islands, can be closed at any time. So he's advocating that if the Russians are no longer willing to negotiate with you over the sovereignty of the Kuril Islands, well, we can show that we have the maritime hard power to actually choke up these supply and logistics routes, which are very central to the economy of the Kuril Islands and the Russian Far East. So this is something that, although the larger Japanese political sphere has not endorsed, but this is really something hawkish coming out of the Japanese camp.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting. That's quite a visible unintended effect that we're seeing from PDI, or even talk about such ideas. One last peripheral issue I want to ask you, Aditya, before we wrap up is, what about India? India is not part of PDI, but what is it doing in, for example, Southeast Asia that might contribute to PDI?
So the US has tried to make India, apart from US forces in the region, as the biggest brick in the bulwark against the People's Republic of China, in my humble opinion. So India also sees an opportunity in collaborating and supplying systems which are beyond the capabilities of many countries in the region. So India has prospects of supplying the BrahMos anti-shipping cruise missile to Vietnam and Philippines at least. So the Philippines Navy chief recently, he alluded to the fact that they're going to purchase at least one battery of BrahMos that they'd be acquiring. So earlier, there were reports going back to 2017 even that they were planning for at least two batteries of BrahMos. But there isn't a signed deal yet. So like a whole lot of things in the Indo-Pacific region as far as cooperation between countries that are looking to deter China, this is also up in the air. And with the Philippines, there's just a lot of unpredictability recently. So they have a visiting forces agreement with the US, and their president kind of tries to use it as a bargaining chip for all sorts of leverage against the US administration on a variety of issues. Say, for example, I remember him coercing vaccines being supplied to his country and attaching that to military hardware and assistance and whatnot that they would get from the US for keeping the visiting forces agreement between the Philippines and the US. So I also remember seeing reports about the Filipino ambassador to the US talking about sending his president the list of hardware the US is ready to supply, and that the ambassador hopes that it will satisfy him. So I don't think I've ever seen a similar statement by any country's ambassador in recent memory. So the Philippines is really a special case. Then there's the dynamic of the Philippines Navy raising militias to patrol their nautical borders and zones of contention in the South China Sea against Chinese Coast Guard. And the Chinese Coast Guard, as we know, recently got the authorization by law to fire at enemy vessels. So India joining the US in supplying hardware to the Philippines is going to be a huge signal. And just let's see how China is going to respond to that. I really don't have any predictions on that, but it would be interesting to see.
Right. Of course, this whole space is going to be interesting to see, interesting to watch, and we're going to keep following it. The PDI is really one of several cogs in this big moving machinery of the US Indo-Pacific strategy. We've seen another element of it with the recent Quad Summit, and we'll be following all these developments and talking about them very closely on this podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, Aditya.
Thank you, Aditya. It's great to be here.
And thank you all for joining us on All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Would like to thank our sponsors on the network this week. Syed, thank you so much for sticking with us. On the Paisa Vaisa podcast, Anupam was joined by Sujata Alawat, who spoke about women's credit behavior and about improving credit scores for better financial health. Gauri Devi Dayal was joined by Barkha Dutt on This Round is on Me. She shared her thoughts on present-day media and journalism and some of her experiences from the days of her reporting. On The Habit Coach, Ashton talked about how meditation is like getting engrossed and absorbed into an activity where you are free of other thoughts and focus on just one thing. On Agla Station Adulthood, Ritasha and Ayushi were joined by Supriya and Priyanka Joshi for an honest and heartfelt conversation about life as a woman in the 2020s. On the Filter Coffee podcast this week, Karthik invited Bala Srinivas, who has been an active mentor in the startup scene in India, and they discuss its various aspects from funding to government support. Our traveling professor Siddharth talks about this academic document called Statement of Purpose and helps us understand its concept and shares and some tips on how to draft it well. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
पेश खिदमत है आपकी शान में हमारे अंजुमन से. Hi, I am Sadaf.
And I'm Arshit. खाने का इतिहास, economics, policy, psychology, सब है मेन्यू पे.
Only on the Nankali podcast every Wednesday, सिर्फ IVM podcast app या वेबसाइट पर या फिर जहां से भी आप अपने पॉडकास्ट सुनते हो.